Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar jointly organized by the International Economic Association and the Royal Economic Society. The topic of today's discussion will be global aspects of COVID-19, and we have a very distinguished panel of 6 speakers who I'll introduce to you one by one before they speak. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to hit developing nations with special force, particularly given the low fiscal resources and poor health systems that prevail in such settings. And while the need for significant international support has been widely acknowledged, rich nations are, for obvious reasons, preoccupied by their own problems. And the response to date has been patchy, to say the least. The risk, of course, therefore, is that many of the gains in economic development reaped over recent decades could be undone by this crisis, and the panel will draw on expertise from different nations to discuss where the policy responses stand and what the priorities are. I'm going to begin by inviting Kaushik Basu from Cornell University, a professor of economics there, and also current president of the International Economic Association and former chief economist of the World Bank, to do some scene setting and also to introduce some of the themes of the seminar. So thank you, Kaushik, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you, everybody. Royal Economic Society in particular, which along with International Economic Association is organizing this important webinar. Let me straight away jump into the issues. I have always followed developing economies, emerging economies very closely, but as it happens, I was visiting India and I'm in a lockdown in India. So I'm watching developments here very, very closely and sort of firsthand as to what's happening. There are concerns about a variety of things. This is a time of concerns around the world that we are living in, but not just as an economist. Out of general concern, let me point out that as the pandemic is panning out, what we are realizing and we need to pay greater attention to is that the controlling the virus, the spread of the COVID, has to go hand in hand with a sensitivity to what happens to the economy. There are lots of reasons for that. One of them, of course, is when the economy gets deeply damaged and people are suffering from malnutrition, from famine, those numbers don't hit you immediately. Whereas when there is a COVID fatality, most of the time, not always, you do miss that, that hits you immediately. And so it is a question of weighing something which you're measuring more carefully and another that you're not measuring, but could be as painful. The initial debate was being discussed in terms of controlling COVID and managing the economy. But really it is for us to realize that it is not a pandemic versus the lives versus the economy. It is a question of lives versus lives, as I feel particularly strongly sitting here in India. Most of the emerging economies, what they have been doing is picking up cues from what happened in advanced economies in rich countries. And very often, I have to say, the early reaction was not early enough. We know that in the United States, the initial steps came far too late. From that, cues have been picked up that you have to act very, very quickly. And most emerging economies across Africa, I'm watching Latin America, South Asia, they have taken very sharp steps. But what is at times being missed out is expressions like lockdown, like closing down an economy. These single words or expressions have very different meanings in different countries, whereas we are picking up from the usage of the word and saying that we have to do better than someone else, treating it almost as a linear thing. I want to just point out to you, I'll read out, I won't even show you, a couple of numbers about the differences in the situation, not just in one developing country, but basically equator, just above the equator and below the equator, this has been pointed out, and advanced economies, USA, North America, and Europe. If you look at COVID fatalities per 10 million population, so 10 million people, the percentage of that, the number within the 10 million, that is dying of fatality, and this number changes from day to day, but the latest, which was, I collected this yesterday, so there'll be a little bit of correction. In Belgium, for every 10 million people, 5,400 is the fatality. Spain, 4,600. Italy, 4,100. France, UK, Sweden, USA, UK is 2,670. Drop down to emerging economies and Latin America and Africa and South Asia. Brazil, it's 140, Chile is 80, Argentina is 40. And remember, I was just now giving you European numbers, which were in thousands, 3,000, 4,000. 140 Brazil, Chile 80, Argentina 40. Come to South Asia, Pakistan 10, Bangladesh 7, India 5, Sri Lanka 3, South Africa 10, Kenya 3, Tanzania 2, Nigeria 1, Ethiopia 0.3. There are these big differences. We can be at the start of a wave which will look similar, but also we have to allow for the fact that this is a pattern we are seeing, and we don't want the economy to be completely locked down so that you are triggering off a famine or a food shortage. It is this balancing act. There's no final answer as to how you strike the balancing act, but to be aware of this is important. There's one lovely piece in Washington Post by someone from the University of Exeter, Julian Jameson. I would strongly recommend people read that, about how we are taking the same model from advanced economies and then mechanically moving along the line of lockdown and trying to outdo one another. We have to do this carefully. Just a couple of points on how you do this carefully, and I will stop, and later on maybe we can come back to some of these issues. During the lockdown, you have to remember one thing, that we usually, economists, progressive economists, remind people that the invisible hand does not deliver everything. But on the other hand, you also have to remember that you can't freeze the economy totally and have the government step in and try to do all the delivery. The invisible hand does play a role, and you can't freeze and try to take care of that. If you just deliver cash, as is being done in many countries, there is a risk that there will be actually famines triggered off. The biggest example of this comes from India, 1943. This is pre-independent India. Amartya Sen has written extensively on this. The famine got triggered, and when it happened, just before the famine came, there was a building up custom that you pay farmers, rural workers in cash instead of kind, which was fine before the famine started. Once the famine started and prices began rising, the cash turned out to be pointless because the rich would outcompete the poor. So it is very important in emerging economies that you have to reach support in kind of basic health support, of food, basic needs in kind. You have to reach it there. The one aspect of the economy that you should not pay too much attention to is the fiscal deficit. Allow the fiscal deficit to become larger, begin to tackle that problem 9 months down the road. But right now, don't really worry about that. Let that happen if that would happen. And finally, I want to point out that the exposure that people have, you have to take lots of precautions against that. Those should be rules that we will follow very clearly. So as you begin to ease up the economy, allow food, allow workers some amount of movement by having rules. Trains should be 1/4 full as they go, instead of a complete freeze. No one can go from one place to another. As you do that, you have to bring in the social distancing rules. Again, nuanced, carefully done. And I feel this, we have to remember that it is a lives versus lives question that we are facing. And economists, not really as a professional chauvinistic remark, have to come in over here and voice this, because for developing countries in particular, this is extremely important. Let me stop at this point, and I will come back with other things later on, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kaushik. We're going to move next to Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who's the Director of the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean in the UN, and I think is going to talk about a perspective from that region. So Luis Felipe, over to you.
Thank you very much, particularly to you, Tim and Kaushik, for the invitation. Great to see you again, this time virtually. And of course, thank you to Danny, Albert, Ashwini, and Haroon. It's a privilege to share the panel, this panel with them. So very briefly, I'm gonna raise some issues that I consider important in the policy conversations that we're having. And I wanna be very honest, I will basically raise questions and ask for attention to some issues that will require very quick thinking and action on our side as the economics community. So if we go to the next, please. So my first point is that we are making decisions on the very, very high levels of uncertainty. Next, please. The amount of cases, I'm going to focus, of course, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I would argue that this is a characterization of middle-income countries in general with large groups of vulnerable populations. So Koshi gave some numbers. So if we look at the specifics, these are normalized by 100,000 people. We can see different stages of the problem in Latin America. However, if we go to the next one, we can see that the capacity to test is very heterogeneous and in some cases very low. So the next one shows that the correlation, I mean, the association, of course, those who tested more have more positive cases. But I would like to focus attention to these countries near the origin where we have low capacity to test or very low number of tests, also a few cases. So we really don't know the extent of the problem. You look at the testing that South Korea did as the global benchmark. Some countries are doing better like Chile, but we really don't know the extent of the problem. So the next graph shows just a comparison we did for Mexico, and we're doing it now for other countries in Latin America. Look at, these are 3 years. This is the seasonal pattern for the first part of the year in terms of acute respiratory infections. Look how in March, the trend that is relatively similar in terms of the seasonal pattern to other years completely goes through the roof. So these, if you take that in terms of numbers, this would be around close to 100,000 people, while the official number of COVID positive cases in Mexico is around 11,000. So this could be an indicator of the extent of the uncertainty or the underestimation and the uncertainty in terms of the scale of the problem. So the next graph only is to make the point that if you look at the World Pandemic Uncertainty Index and you compare with other pandemics or other cases, we see that the uncertainty went through the roof. So bottom line, we're making decisions under a very high level of uncertainty. Next one, please. Given that, and we go to the next, perhaps, the containment policies are very strict. So throughout Latin America and throughout the world, we have very severe restrictions or even full lockdowns. In Latin America, you see the map here, pretty much every country, and basically all borders except Brazil and Mexico are closed. So the next one, please. However, are these lockdowns being enforced? Look at these, comparison by countries. I could point out here, I don't have the control of the presentation, so I cannot show with my mouse, but if you go to the right corner and you see how many people are actually staying at home and compare by the share of poor people in the country. So you see Haiti, where of course there are many more people who are poor, they are basically not staying at home. Whereas, for example, Chile or Uruguay is much better. But look at Mexico as well. Even though the level of poverty is relatively lower, the enforcement is very poor in the sense that people are not staying at home. If we do that within countries in the next graph, and we do it for Colombia, we see again that the regions of the country in which poverty is higher, the enforcement or the mobility has really decreased very little or much less than in other regions. So what does that mean, of course, is that people cannot stay at home, cannot afford to stay at home because they depend on their day, the capacity to generate income every day. And that is why the policies really have to consider this. But let's go to the next, because I would like to point out to the different channels through which, of course, the crisis is impacting. Of course, the demand shock, the falling commodity prices, the shock in financial markets, disruption in supply chains, declining remittances. We're trying to understand these effects. Danny will expand more on the external shock, for example, and I'm sure we'll go over many of these issues. But in the next one, you see just one graph that shows you the magnitude of the shock. So look at the blue line, which is the crisis in 2008. This is the outflow of financial flows from emerging economies. So this was the shock in 2008, 2009. This is the huge outflow of resources in the flight to safety. Look at the magnitude of this flight to safety in this case. So again, the magnitude of this shock is unprecedented. Next one, please. So there is an important element that is not completely distinguished in the conversation. One thing is what economic policies you have to put in place to make the health strategy effective. As I showed before, to make people stay at home. So you need economic measures to make people stay at home, as Santiago Levy presented in a recent paper he prepared for UNDP. And then a different question is, what are the counter-cyclical measures you take in the next stage? So the next one only shows very briefly these three stages. We're in the first stage where you need economic policies to control the pandemic. And in that, you need economic policies that should focus less on inclusion errors. This is not about targeting in the traditional sense. This is about compensating people so they stay at home. The second stage is about the recovery. Next one, please. So it is important that in a region or in countries like the case in Latin America where the informality is so large, people have to go out every day to generate income. So how do you compensate for that? Not only with through income, as Kaushik said, but also with in-kind goods, because first, because as Kaushik said, you distort markets in some cases, but the other is markets themselves. If people have to go to buy food and other goods, these have actually sources of contagion. So in Panama and Ecuador and other places, we're actually delivering in-kind goods. The next one, please. So basically, the idea in this context, and you have to make very clear that in the stage in which we are, you need to protect vulnerable and poor populations. You need instruments to do that. You need to protect formal employment and including support to firms, so employment is not destroyed and the recovery becomes more difficult. But also protect non-poor informal workers. And this is the thing that we are not used to do, because here what matters is not whether they are poor, but whether they can actually afford to stay at home. And finally, the idea that Kaushik mentioned about in-kind support for populations that either don't have access to markets or are at risk of contagion. The next one, please, and I'm gonna end soon. So when thinking about the recovery, I think we need a different way of approaching this because of what I said before. Very high levels of uncertainty, the issue that we're accompanying a health-related strategy first, that if it's not successful, it's gonna make it more difficult to have a recovery. So we're making these decisions under unprecedented levels of uncertainty. In terms of the fiscal space, which Kaushik briefly mentioned, it's very difficult right now, and I would challenge anybody to tell me how we can properly define debt sustainability in a context where we don't know the path to the new steady state, and we cannot characterize what that steady state is going to look like. So it is particularly challenging to try to address this issue of what we mean by debt sustainability, for example. The other is the coordination in financial markets. Rating agencies having given important shocks with downgrades to Colombia, to Mexico. I think it is important that they take into account the speed of recovery and not only the fiscal imbalance and what we do with middle-income countries that have very difficult access to financial markets because all the efforts are focusing on relief to LDCs. Finally, the sequencing. This is something we're discussing with governments and it's very difficult to address. You have a constraint, which is avoiding a new wave of contagion, but you also need to think in terms of the sequencing, how to reopen the economy, which sectors go first, what kind of standards you need for that reopening. And that is something we are not used to think about. And so in a way, for lack of a better term, I'm thinking about some type of industrial policy type of thinking, where you say, what is the right sequencing to reopen and to restart the economy? So again, I'm basically opening questions for discussion. I think we are in a particularly complicated context that requires a lot of creative thinking on our side. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. We now turn to the experience of Africa, where we're going to have Albert Zoifak, who's going to talk to us. He's the chief economist for Africa at the World Bank. So Albert, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to fellow panelists. I will share with you findings of our recent economic outlook for Africa. Our Africa's Pulse, published on April 9, look at the economic impact of COVID and the policy responses from sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. Next, yeah, thank you. Let me share 7 key messages with you, and then I'll spend a little bit more time on the policy response later on. So first, what is clear is that despite its late arrival on the continent, COVID is already taking a toll on African economies. Second, the pandemic will lead sub-Saharan Africa to its first recession in 25 years. In fact, we're projecting that GDP growth will decline from 2.4% in 2019 to a range of -2% to -5%, depending on the assumption. And economies in sub-Saharan Africa could lose between $37 and $79 billion in 2020. Third, there will also be a shock on household income and household welfare, and we are projecting a decline between 7 and 14%. In 14% in our less optimistic assumption. Fourth, the region could face a severe food crisis, as Kaushik has mentioned earlier, with agricultural production declining and could decline by up to 7%, combined with a decline in imports and locusts currently invading East Africa. Fifth message. We believe that African policy response should be really differentiated to reflect the structural features of these economies, but also the constraints that policymakers face in these countries. Six, we believe, basically it's quite obvious from the shock that African governments do not have any wiggle room to really deploy the kind of fiscal policy that is needed to fight this crisis, and they would need an emergency stimulus package. Seven, the World Bank and IMF have spearheaded a huge advocacy movement for a debt standstill. We believe that's going to be extremely important in allowing African countries to fight this crisis and avoid more people falling below the poverty line. Next, next please. Then next again, next. Look, what is the situation today in Africa? It's been clearly a low start, a slow start as well. And as of April 22nd, we had more than 13,000 cases across sub-Saharan Africa, of which 347 deaths. And the number of cases reported in the last 24 hours between April 21st and 22nd was 543. The countries that are the most affected are South Africa, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, which have clearly continue really opening borders and bringing in flights from Europe that, the case of Cameroon precisely, late arrivals from Europe clearly really jump-started the spread of the disease. Next. Yeah, the crisis has already really started to impact African economies, and in the couple of slides that I'll show here, you'll see an early impact. We've seen a disruption in supply chains for sure, and a decline in commodity prices that is clearly causing a fiscal fiscal crunch in a number of African countries. Oil has declined by more than 50% since March. Countries like Angola, Republic of Congo are clearly in a fiscal crisis as we speak. And Nigeria as well will clearly be impacted by this decline in commodity prices. We've seen a collapse in manufacturing orders across the continent. Next. Using high frequency data from Google, we can already start monitoring if Africans are actually observing the lockdown or not. And these numbers are from Senegal. You can see a decline in 44% in visiting retail and recreation places. Grocery stores are down by 31%. And if you compare these numbers across African countries, you actually see which countries are actually observing those lockdowns and those where people are still very, very casual about it. Next. Okay, so next, what we have seen also is, on financial markets in Africa have reacted extremely negatively, and sovereign bonds have clearly skyrocketed, as you can see on these slides. And we've seen yields for countries like Ghana, really, really shooting up. Next. We're already seeing deteriorating fiscal current account deficit, and these are certainly expected to widen. Next. Inflation, while still quite low, and it's important to notice that before COVID, African countries have actually managed to really reduce inflation, and there were not more than 5 African countries with inflation at double digit. Now we're seeing inflationary pressures building up, and some following currency depreciations. Next. What we've done in the policies to use macrostructural models and the CGE, combine those to actually assess the impact of this crisis on African economies. And we clearly see a reduction in growth up to 5.2 percentage points in 2020. And next. Most of this decline will come from our 3 largest economies, Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, which were clearly not already performing that well before the crisis. Nigeria was experiencing a very sluggish recovery. South Africa and Angola were already in recession. Next. But what we'll see is all categories of countries, including the non-mineral exporters, non-oil exporters, would also be affected in Africa. We are projecting just a slightly positive growth for non-oil and non-mineral exporters across Africa. Next. So, in our CG modeling, we clearly identify all those channels, and what is quite important here is to see how imports have really, really collapsed, and we do project a decline in export in imports in 2020. Consumptions also would drive the decline in GDP. Next. Household welfare would certainly be impacted as well, and will certainly, in the worst assumption, where not only the crisis is protracted all the way to 2021, and there is no cooperation across African countries, borders remain closed to people and trade, we can have a welfare decline by up to 7%, by up to 14%. Next. Agriculture would be affected, definitely, and combined with imports would clearly fearing that we could have a food crisis. Next, let me go to the policy response. African central banks have clearly reduced rates, but they are not doing clearly enough from my perspective in terms of using other tools to allow firms to have more liquidity. Next. It's clear that African countries have reacted to this crisis by basically importing the very aggressive containment measures and implementing them, but clearly with the large informal sector, such as in Latin America, this is unlikely to work, and we're already seeing some riots and civil unrest in some countries. Social protection measures have been taken, but it's a mixed bag of cash transfer, in-kind, a waiver for basic services. And I see two big risks here. One is the risk of financial sustainability for utilities that were not already performing that well before. And the second is derailing the revenue mobilization efforts of the past 5 years if we draw too much on the fiscal to support the formal private sector. Third, very important aspect is, agricultural supply chain. To avoid the food inflation that Kaushik mentioned, we clearly need to ensure that disruptions in food supply chains are not widespread across countries. Next. I'll just end with what the World Bank is clearly doing here. We have a three-pronged approach. One is preserving lives, second is preserving livelihoods, and the third is preserving the future. And first, we are launching health projects, emergency health projects, to equip countries with testing materials and protect medical personnel, and also water and sanitation projects. We're providing budget support to countries, and creating that fiscal space is going to be critical. We are pushing for more debt relief, including from private and commercial creditors. The second is protecting and preserving livelihoods, basically social protections. Cash transfer definitely are working, especially in countries that have a good digital infrastructure. And the third, protecting firms as well, supporting firms in this very difficult period. But one very important aspect in this area is maintaining the presence of the state, especially in conflict-affected countries. Security is critical. And the third pillar of our action is how do we sow the seed of resilience in the current policy response? How do we think ahead and protect vital investment as countries restructure their public expenditure to react? And how do we learn the lessons as we go, not to waste this crisis? Next and final slide. Some early lessons I see. One, the digital is clearly not a luxury for Africa, and we've been hearing this debate about digital. We see now that countries that have the best digital infrastructure are those that may actually manage this crisis better. Second, the disruption in value chain is raising questions across Africa about industrial policy. Are we heading towards an industrial policy 3.0? Is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and regional value chains the solution? That's not obvious for me. The heavy dependence of food in Africa is also raising a lot of questions. Africa imports $35 to $40 billion of food, basic foodstuff, and a number of countries are already at risk of food crisis because they can import the rice from Vietnam or from Thailand. Next is the health sector. I think the idea of health being a social sector is really dangerous, and we're now really realizing how it is important to revisit the question of health financing in African countries. Commodity dependence is clearly one of the reasons why volatility and poverty would clearly remain. And last but not least, the debt question needs to come back on the table. A number of our countries have been borrowing extensively from non-concessional sources. And countries like Zambia, for example, have 60% of their debt now owned to private and commercial creditors. This is going to be very difficult, especially there's no coordination mechanism to actually get those private creditors to come to the table for a debt relief. Let me stop here. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Albert. So we're going to stay in Africa now with Haroon Borat from the University of Cape Town, although I noticed that, I apologize. We're going now to Ashwini Deshpande from India. She's Professor of Economics at Ashoka University. So apologies, Ashwini, it's over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I would actually like to change track a little bit and talk about women and the pandemic. But before I do that, I would like to also mention that my colleagues and I at Ashoka University have actually produced a policy brief talking about many of the issues that have come up in the previous presentations. That policy brief is on our website, and I'd encourage people to go and take a look at that. But I want to change track and bring to the fore an important issue in the context of the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic. Next slide, please. And I actually want to start with an example which sort of cuts to the end of my presentation. By the end of the presentation, I hope to persuade you that looking at the pandemic and its responses through the gender lens is needed, if not for anything else, than just to contain the pandemic. And in order to illustrate that, I want to start with an example from the Indian state of Kerala, which is one of the states that has had the most successful pandemic control ever since it broke out in India. So it's a southern Indian state. There are 437 cases, 308 recoveries, 2 deaths. It's got a 70% recovery rate, which is the highest in India. And why it's achieved this a remarkable success has been discussed a lot, the so-called Kerala model. But I'm going to focus on a few aspects of the Kerala model that are integral to my argument, the argument that I'm making about gender. So Kerala has had a long history of investing in public health, much even before the Indian independence. After independence, the state has focused a lot on literacy and on women's education. It's got close to 100% vaccination levels. It's got a strong culture of public hygiene. In fact, there was a survey which said that the highest prevalence of hand washing with soap after defecation is to be found in the state of Kerala amongst all Indian states. So when COVID-19 hit and when the Break the Chain campaign started, which emphasized on hand washing, it was easy for Kerala to follow that model because that culture of hand washing already existed. And this involved a heavy investment in women's education and in public health. Kerala also, like other states in India, Kerala also has a network of women's self-help groups, which were primarily set up for empowering women. But in Kerala, they actually work very closely with the local government, which are these elected local bodies at the rural and urban levels. And it's this entire network of women entrepreneurs, which are small scale entrepreneurs, who have been pitching in with frontline volunteers, running community kitchens, making masks, and generally helping with the pandemic control activities. So the point that I take away from the Kerala model is that if you invest in gender, if you look at issues through the gender lens, then at some point when you need it, it actually pays off. Now let me move, next slide, please. Let me move to a point which came up a little bit in the previous presentations, but I think it needs to be highlighted, which is that what the pandemic has done is that it's exposed the fault lines in all our societies. It's been hard on everyone, but it's been devastating for some groups. And the pandemic and the lockdown have basically exposed the deep cracks of inequality that have always divided our societies, but they've sort of come to the fore, sort of like they would after an earthquake. And the inequalities that shape our societies are marked by class, gender, race, caste, all kinds of social identities. Next slide, please. And I'm going to focus on gender today, not because it's the most important identity, but it's definitely affects 50% of the population. And it's certainly something where if you pay attention to the gender dynamics of the way in which the policy response plays out, we could actually, apart from meeting the ideal of gender equality, we could also make huge progress on containing the disease and the economic aftermaths. So one of the things that's clear in all the countries is that essential services are on even during the lockdown, and essential workers everywhere, whether they're cashiers, emergency room nurses, drugstore pharmacists, home health aid workers, etc. These workers are disproportionately women. And intersectionality plays a role here, which is that in most countries, not only are these workers women, but they are predominantly drawn from marginalized communities, groups within these countries, including in India. But we have to remember that being essential does not mean that these workers are well compensated or even noticed, actually. It's only now that we are realizing how much of a backbone they are to our economies. Next slide, please. Uh, Similarly, frontline health workers, if you see the graph here, on the left-hand side, you see the male-female division of doctors. And on the right-hand side, you see the male-female division of nurses. And you see how the sharp gender contrast in the division of doctors versus division of nurses. And if you include within, this chart is for nurses, but if you include within nurses, the absolutely frontline health workers, who work in primary health clinics, etc. In India, we have a group of women called accredited social health activists, the ASHA workers, who are all female. And so if you include within nurses the frontline health workers, then they are disproportionately female. And at the moment in India, especially, we find that they have minimal gear, they have an acute shortage of PPE, and therefore they are at a heightened risk of infection. In addition to that, because they are working with the pandemic control measures, they are separated from their families, they are anxious, there's a high degree of mental stress, both on themselves and on their families. In India, there's been a very disturbing trend where when these workers come back home from their hospitals after, or the health clinics, after serving long time there, they face social ostracism, they face isolation, and there have also been incidents of assault due to the stigma attached to the disease. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide, please? So the left-hand column of this next slide is about the economic recession, about which I won't say anything further because the previous speakers have already talked about that. But I do want to talk about the gendered impacts of the lockdown. Now, one of the things that's happening in the lockdown is that schools are closed, kids are at home. And the fact that children are at home and they have to be homeschooled, mothers are disproportionately affected by this relative to their fathers, just because of the history of the way in which care work and childcare is divided within families, where mothers disproportionately take up these jobs. There are travel restrictions both across countries and within cities, and women migrants are affected more, and they are likely to be affected more even after the lockdown lifts slightly, because they're going to find it harder to move to their places of work. There's burden of care within the families. The burden of care is related to taking care of children, taking care of the elderly, taking care of everybody's health, well-being, cooking, cleaning, all the domestic chores. And the point that I think we need to understand repeatedly, and I'm going to make this one more time later because it's a very important point that needs to be emphasized, is that when women have less decision-making power, both within the households and in governments, their needs are less likely to take priority in any policy framework. So within families, it's less likely that people will adjust to their needs. And within governments, it's less likely that a gendered perspective is going to show up in policy making. Next slide, please. In terms of the gendered impact of lockdowns, I've already talked about the care responsibilities. I will talk about the fact that one of the things that we've seen in earlier epidemics as well is that when there's a health crisis and resources get diverted to tackling that particular health crisis, one of the things that suffers is women's access to reproductive health. So a budget that gets cut down is women's reproductive health budget, and that leads to lack of access to contraception, unsafe abortions, neglect of newborn healthcare, etc., unmet demand for contraception, which has disastrous effects on women's lives and their children's lives later on. For middle class professionals who are working from home, who can be more productive? Only those people can be more productive who don't have childcare responsibilities, and indeed, responsibilities for other care work inside the families. And there is already what is known as a maternal wall, which is young women who are at the start of their careers. They're also the time when they are thinking of starting their families, and they face discrimination and limitations because of this particular. There was a joke from Twitter, which I won't repeat because I'm running short of time. But can I just have the next slide, please? Because I do want to talk about this thing that as countries have been announcing lockdowns, there's been a spike to helplines in each country reporting domestic abuse, either with or without violence. And so this is called the shadow pandemic. So it's following the pandemic everywhere. These are some figures from India, which are the absolute underestimates, because these are complaints made to the National Commission of Women in India, where people don't typically, that's not the first port of call. Whenever there's a complaint, people typically go to the police, but the police data are not released yet. And if you compare the complaints made to the National Commission of Women in March and April of 2019 versus March of this year and up to April 13, for which I had data, you can clearly see that even compared to even those 13 days, including only 13 days of April, there's been a spike in complaints about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, which these are problems that are already susceptible to very large amounts of underreporting because of who the perpetrator is, which is somebody in the family, and because of where the crime takes place, which is within the household. Next slide, please. And finally, my point is about so all of this is leading up to the point is that if we want to understand the gendered nature of COVID and the gendered nature of the pandemic, we need to collect gender disaggregated data. I was looking at sources, and I looked at this source called Global Health 50/50, and out of 56 countries for which we have
Okay, we seem to have lost Ashwini.
Yes, I can't hear her either.
Okay, so that's unfortunate. Should we move on? I think we probably should. If Leighton, if you could send her a message, that would be good. So we're going to move next to Haroon Borat from the University of Cape Town, who's a member of the economics department there. Haroon, over to you. We are getting a little pressed for time, I should say, before you start, because we want to have some time for Q&A later. But over to you, Haroon.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I know we are pressed for time, so my focus is country-based, and essentially it's sort of, as the title indicates, early impressions from COVID-19 in South Africa. And essentially, next slide, please. I'll focus on 5 key areas. I'll give you a brief overview of the public health response and some of the sort of early evidence around that with respect to COVID-19, then go on to some of the SNAP surveys that have been done on the economic shocks that firms have faced, as well as some of the macro projections. Thirdly, to unveil President Ramaphosa's stimulus package, which he announced day before yesterday, and to give some numbers around that in international context. And then perhaps fourthly, show how labor economics actually can be useful in thinking about lockdown economics. And then finally, a little bit about the fiscal deficit numbers. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing about South Africa is if you compare us to, I've chosen 2 emerging markets here, and then the UK and the US, is that after starting out on a very similar trajectory in terms of COVID-19 cases, we see a significant flattening of the curve, if you like, for South Africa. Now, that may be explained, at least initially, by 2 key factors. One is a very early, but also a very strict lockdown, right? So the conditions of our lockdown seem to be much stricter than many other countries. And then secondly, a very strong concerted effort to contain what were essentially imported cases. As Albert mentioned, foreign or South Africans coming from abroad, mainly high-income earners, were kept away from communities, and that managed to sort of stave off the growth of the epidemic. It should be said, though, that we are on the cusp. So what that's done is bought us time, but we're on the cusp of an exponential growth of the epidemic, as epidemiologists tell us, and we shift into community transition. Next slide, please. We have an interesting component of our public health environment within South Africa. People may know that we have the largest number of individuals globally living with HIV/AIDS, numbered at about 7.7 million. We are the global epicenter for the epidemic. We have also, though, the largest cohort of individuals on ARV treatment. Why that's important is that that environment has created a huge number of what are called community health workers. They're number 28,000, as the graphic shows, and that has allowed these individuals to be redeployed, if you like, as individuals who are diagnosing, isolating, contact tracing, and treating COVID-19 cases. So we have an unusual situation in South Africa that enables us to, if you like, react to COVID-19, given the HIV/TB experience. Next slide, please. So with that public health environment, what has been the economic, what have been the sort of economic shocks that we observed? This is data based on a rapid diagnostic firm survey done by a consulting firm. What's important, though, is that you're seeing heterogeneity across sectors. Sectors not really defined in the SIC sense, but you do see some sectors have completely closed down. So you've got aviation and restaurants, of course, and others that are operating at significantly below capacity. At less than 20%, you've got sectors ranging from construction to online retail. It's interesting to note the top end, you've got food, retail, pharmaceuticals, professional banking services that are actually operating at way above 80% capacity. Next slide. Now, one of the things that we need to try and understand, and of course all the macro models have tried to do that, is what are the projections for growth? Albert presented some of those for Sub-Saharan Africa. There are two factors that are important here. First is, of course, the average consensus view is that South Africa's growth for 2020 will contract by about 6.4%. But the second factor is that all projections of all the macro models, including the IMF and our own South African Reserve Bank, indicate a very strong bounce back. I would suggest, though, that these forecasts use projections based on the intensity and the length of lockdowns. That's a completely new element in these macro models, and it's not clear to me that we know enough and we have enough information about the lockdown to GDP transmission to actually make those predictions. Next slide, please. The World Bank macrosum model shows significantly deep cuts in terms of poverty and inequality. So the poverty numbers I don't show here, but they show dramatic rise in household poverty levels and absolute and relative poverty levels. This is a growth incidence curve based on the macrosum estimates using a lockdown of 3 months. What it shows is significant declines across the distribution and deeper cuts at the bottom end and in the middle of the distribution. Again, just to note that the model is based on a 3-month lockdown assumption. Next slide, please. In the face of the lockdown, in the face of severe contraction in the economy, in the face of growing hunger and food insecurity, President Ramaphosa announced in 2 nights ago a massive stimulus package. This is a stimulus package that is the largest we've seen in the post-94 era, the democratic era for South Africa. And you'll note in the right graph that as a percentage of GDP at 6.7%, this is a stimulus package or COVID-19 expenditure package that is the highest amongst the emerging market sample that I have there. It's the highest I've seen in the emerging market sample. If you look more closely at what the stimulus package is made up of, it's clear that there's sort of 2 or 3 big hitters, if you like. There's the credit guarantee scheme that's backed by government, of course, run through the banks for firms, and that's to support cash flow, very clearly to support cash flow amongst firms. The second is to protect the wage bill, and so you've got a significant wage subsidy scheme operating through the tax system. And thirdly, to take care of growing food insecurity and to protect vulnerable households, we've got a fairly extensive support to both the social assistance scheme and to the informal sector and the unemployed. Next slide, please. One of the things, so moving on to my fourth sort of component of the input, one of the things that I think the panelists are much better equipped than me to deal with is how macro models can provide guidance on this interaction between where the stage of the epidemic is and the lockdown. And one can think of lockdowns in terms of frequency, length, and intensity. And the interaction between those two are going to impact on growth. And as for example, you may have a severe lockdown that ends suddenly, and then the epidemic then takes off in a completely different direction. That's going to have particular impacts on the economy. The little bit that labor economics can offer is to develop what I've called a COVID-sensitive measure of sectors and occupations. Next slide. And what we try and do here is using, and I won't go into details because of time, using the ONET classification system of the US Department of Labor, and based on a really good paper, NBR paper from Dingle and Neyman, you can do 2 things. One is to derive a score for whether you can or cannot work from home. And the second, which is what I guess our value add is derive a physical interaction index based on physical proximity, frequency of contact, and so on. Next slide. And what we derive there, if you look carefully, if I just take, so we have a grid then by sector, which compares the physical interaction index against the share that could work from home. So if you look at the top blue dot, which is finance, that would suggest that there's a significant share, greater than 50% of individuals in the finance sector can work from home, right? And they are below the median in terms of the physical interaction index. In other words, there isn't close physical proximity. That would suggest that it's a strong trigger for easing lockdown rules for that sector with the ability for them to work at home. If you look at education on the far right, it's exactly the opposite. And so one can begin to use these indices that are applied at occupations and then hardwired to sectors to derive lockdown rules. Next slide. So if we collect all the evidence on the sort of economic shock and what's happened on the, in terms of the stimulus package, one of the things I know Kaushik mentioned at the outset that this is not the time to worry about deficits. That's good news. The slide is just South Africa's deficit to GDP ratio. On the far left, you have the current deficit to GDP, which was already one of the highest we've seen since democracy, 6.83. If one assumes that's the 0 bar, if one assumes no change in GDP and revenue collection stays the same, the deficit goes up to about 13.4%. My good colleague Professor Tanya Ajam says that the 15% figure, the third from the right bar, is where we're likely to land up as the deficit to GDP ratio of 19%. If I could have the last slide. So in essence, South Africa suggests a country where early lockdown and strict lockdowns have slowed down the growth of the infections. We're on the cusp of, epidemiologists tell us, a sort of exponential growth in those infections. We hope that community healthcare workers will be key to stemming that growth. The significant GDP contraction of 6% leads to a bounce back, although I'm worried about lockdown presumptions and assumptions into 2021. The president has announced the biggest stimulus package we've seen in the emerging market world. There are question marks about how that's going to impact on the deficit. And then finally, I think it's interesting for us as analysts to think about how lockdowns and decision rules for lockdowns how the tools of economics can be used to provide decisions around lockdowns. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Haroon. So we'll next turn to Danny Roderick, who's a professor of economics at Harvard, and also the incoming president of the International Economic Association. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you, Tim. I think we've heard a very nice set of overviews on what's happening in the developing world, and I think the daunting nature of the challenges have been laid in front of us. I'm afraid I'm not going to have much optimism to add to many of the points that we have already heard, but I do think that there are some ideas around that I just want to highlight as to what are some of the things that the international community, in particular, can do. I just want to. I'm going to be brief. I just really want to make two broad points. One is really about the nature of the external shock, and this is the largest external shock that developing countries as a group will have experienced since the Great Depression. And the second point that's linked to that is that when the developing world goes through such a major external shock, that it has implications for development strategy, and sort of during the Great Depression, the terms of trade shock and the protectionism in the advanced countries had the effect that many developing countries started on very different growth strategies, development strategies, much more inward looking. That's where import substitution policies start and so forth. So the second big question is whether this is also a point at which we will see a major departure in developing country policies. And the two are linked in a way that I'll briefly indicate at the end of my very brief remarks. Developing countries are different from advanced countries in a lot of respects, and we've heard them. Public health systems are much weaker. There are significant differences in economic structure, employment informality. The gendered nature of the shock is probably revealed itself in a much more severe form in a developing country, poor country settings. But two differences that I want to highlight from a macroeconomic standpoint is that there are two very specific transfer, or using the language of an earlier era of economics, transfer problems or transfer challenges developing countries face. One on which I think a lot of we've already heard a lot about is raising the fiscal capacity. Developing countries, governments will have to expand safety nets and fiscal supports of much larger amounts than we've seen in recent past, and that's going to require kind of a transfer from the private sectors of these countries to the public sector. And this is a very different problem in the developing world than in the advanced countries, because in the developing countries, we're in a relatively low saving environments. Financial markets tend to be shallow, and interest rates tend to be much more sensitive to fiscal policy in a way that has not been the case in the developed world recently. So the big challenge here is going to be, yes, absolutely, as Kaushik said, it's not the time to worry about fiscal deficits, but the risk of significant expansions in the deficit in terms of the internal debt servicing cost, higher interest rates, and also inflation, a problem that we have not worried about of late. I think those are serious problems that developing countries face that advanced countries don't necessarily face at this particular moment. The second transfer problem is really from the rest of the world to developing nations, and that's the one that I want to say a little bit more about. developed nations do not face the kind of outflow or negative external shock in the same way that developing countries have faced. We've already heard from Luis Felipe, what the initial decline in flows to the developing countries in terms of equity outflows and outflows of short-term finance. Those have been worse than any time in recent decades. But those external shocks go beyond these short-term portfolio equity flows. We have the possibility of much vaster sudden stop in capital inflows, and if that happens, that would be at least of the order of 10% of GDP. This is assuming that developing countries are unable to go to market and don't get any additional disbursement. 10% of GDP is just the sovereign part of it. There will be additional from private borrowers as well. The terms of trade shock for commodity exporters that we've already heard from Albert talked about it. There are other, the reduction in exports and remittances in tourism revenues, and the domestic capital flight that is always lurking in addition to complicate all of these as well. I put sort of rough orders of magnitude in relation to GDP just to indicate, in fact, how large are these numbers that we're talking about. So this is a major external shock. And I think what we have seen so far in terms of assisting developing, emerging, and low-income countries in dealing with these shocks has been highly inadequate. Essentially, just a kind of a standstill on bilateral loans to the lowest income countries. But we will need to expand that. There are a lot of good ideas. Patrick Bolton and co-authors have come up with a plan that would entail a standstill on sovereign debt service to private creditors. And this would be sort of roughly $800 billion, or about 5% of GDP of developing countries, excluding China. And the interesting idea here is that there would be a multilaterally governed financial facility that developing countries would reroute their interest payments to this facility, and then and the resources thereby saved, that are not spent on servicing debt to creditors, would be channeled to public health or more urgent immediate economic needs. I think one should, in fact, extend on that idea, because so much of particularly emerging market debt has been incurred by private borrowers, private banks, or corporates, that one can extend that idea to private debtors as well. And there, we would need to think of a kind of a quote quid pro quo between the governments and the private debtors in the developing world, that governments would, for a period, guarantee banks and corporates debt service during this health emergency in return for a variety of commitments that banks and corporates agree to, such as maintaining employment and maintaining credit. The idea of a SDR allocation to expand liquidity to developing countries has been suggested. Unfortunately, this so far has not taken hold, in part due to opposition from India, in addition to the United States, which is something I don't quite understand. I think we also need to think about the role that capital controls can play in this context to stem self-fulfilling financial panics. And I think what the international community can do here is actually multilaterally sanction such capital controls to avoid the stigma that individual country use of capital controls sometimes might create. Let me just say a couple of words on sort of the medium-term impacts on policy. As I've mentioned, periods of extensive external shocks such as this one have often thrown developing countries onto somewhat different development paths. What I would like to say here is that this shock is mainly going to reinforce a deglobalizing trend that's already been in effect. So if you look at the trade in relation to global output, it's not rising nearly as rapidly since the Great Recession. Global value chains have really stopped growing. Even services trade has had some adverse links. So I think there's all reason to believe that trade and global value chains are going to be much less important as drivers of economic growth going forward. The big question here is whether this will be further amplified by the consequences of these terms of trade shocks, inadequate access to finance, advanced country protectionism, and a generalized foreign currency shortage, and whether that pushes developing countries into an even more inward oriented kind of a growth strategy. And I think that's one of the questions that's on my mind. So let me just stop here. And Tim, back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks to actually all of our panelists for some really thought-provoking and informative presentations. We have almost no time for questions. I've been fed one or two through the various channels. So let me try one question that tries a little bit to get at, summarize a number of the questions I've received. And that's really around the possibility that countries are being too influenced, particularly say in relation to lockdowns, by what's going on elsewhere. In other words, lockdowns may be appropriate in some places, but less so in others. And there is a risk that there's too much policy coordination in a way, because it's not a policy that needs to be coordinated, given the circumstances that developing countries face in particular. Of course, again, as heterogeneity, different countries have different priorities. Does anyone want to react to that idea, which has certainly been raised among those asking questions?
Tim, I wouldn't mind jumping in briefly. I feel really what is very important is to distinguish between lockdowns and lockdowns. It's being treated virtually as a linear scale, and countries are competing to do better on that. So exactly what you lock down, to what extent you lock down, we almost need a terminology, because otherwise I'm hearing, for instance, sitting in India, that as soon as it's announced that Macron is locking down for another 2 weeks, we are saying, well, we have to do it for another 2 weeks minimally, not realizing that that term is being used very differently. And I wish economists would classify a little bit and have different kinds of lockdowns in order to create the space which the language is cramping. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to come in response to that?
I'll just like to say that, in India, we are at 100% stringency in terms of lockdowns. So there's this Oxford school that's created an index of stringency, and it's really a pause button. It doesn't take away. So when lockdowns will get lifted, you will have to again engage with how to contain the disease and yet get economic activity started. So by repeatedly pushing the pause button, if we think that you're going to make progress on the pandemic, that's not going to happen. And so one of the things we've argued for in our brief in Ashoka is that we can have localized lockdowns depending on the spread of the disease, but economic activity cannot be allowed to suffer for the whole country. We have at the moment a national lockdown going on, which is extremely strict and stringent. And so it can't be a 0-1, either lockdown or fully functional. And we need to look at a graded response, just exactly like Kaushik said.
Okay, and one other question we might just be able to squeeze in has been around the informality issue. Is it the case that actually informality could be an advantage in dealing with this because of the relative flexibility, or is it a problem because of the difficulty of reaching people in that situation? But I've had a question on the web, is it kind of a good or bad feature that makes it more or less difficult? Does anyone want to come in on that? Luis Felipe.
Can I start here?
Yes, please, Albert. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, first of all, coming back quickly on the point on lockdown, I think one important factor is government's credibility to enforce lockdowns. Countries like South Africa can probably manage to implement aggressive lockdowns without huge consequence, although we're also seeing some riots. But number of African countries actually have lost so much credibility that those instructions are not being followed. So agreeing with Kaushik here that we really need to make sure we don't copycat. It's not because a government in Europe is enforcing lockdown that is going to work in our countries. And we're seeing examples, taxi drivers have gone on strike in Douala because they were just asked to take 2 passengers in the car. They were not even asked to stop. So, and the second point is, as we implement the lockdown, if there is no parallel implementation of social protection programs, it's clearly going to fail. And that leads me to that informality question. I think informality can actually be an advantage in cases where we have the digital infrastructure to target them. And we can actually target them with social protection in one go, because the line between household and firms is actually very, very blurred in that case. So if you have a good digital infrastructure, you can actually target all the household and micro and small firms through social protection programs. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. Luis Felipe, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, briefly, team. So one is, again, on the lockdowns, I think it's important to make the point that the capacity, particularly in the health sector, is the main issue. And I think this has to be informed by the health strategy, in the sense that if you had the capacity to really test, isolate, and so on, then you should be able to do a more intelligent, let's say, lockdown. But I think the lack of capacity creates this uncertainty and leads you to very radical measures. The second point is, on the informality, I would say that the net effect in this case of informality, I would argue, is negative, because what you need for these lockdowns to be effective is voluntary compliance. Yes, it is about government capacity to enforce, but also it's about voluntary compliance. And people, in this case, you don't have the mechanisms to reach those people, to compensate for them to voluntarily comply with the lockdown. So they have to go out and try to generate income by themselves. So I think in this case, both for the health strategy and for the recovery, I see that the net effect of large informality could be actually rather a constraint rather than a positive aspect.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think I should bring things to a close, but thanks to Kaushik, Luis Felipe, Albert, Ashwini, Haroon, and Danny, all for their really very interesting presentations. Thanks to everyone who's joined us either on YouTube or on Zoom. There's so many big and important questions have been raised, and even some answers given, but I think we're all scrambling around finding it easier to ask questions than to provide answers. But never has, I think, been a time when clear-headed thinking and good analysis has the potential to deliver for the world as much as it does now. And it's wonderful to hear from people who are really trying very hard to provide that advice and guidance that the world needs. So thank you to all of you, and thanks for joining us. And there will be future Royal Economic Society webinars, and I look forward to welcoming you to those. With that, I'll draw matters to a close. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.